Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. You are watching and listening to Historian Radio's The Historians Collection, and I am your host and curator, Muhammad Hussain Qazi. Now, you may have noticed that I was unfortunately absent for the past few months, and this serial is the reason why. As many of you who in our audience who I do know personally or who personally know me would know that I am a passionate antique collector, and that is something that I've decided to bring to this channel now. We are currently putting a bit of a stop in our other series so that we can try and get this one launched and off the ground. So this will be a monthly series where hopefully at the first Monday of every month, we shall bring to you an episode straight from the Historians Collection, in which we shall be showing you different items that I have accumulated as a passionate antique collector over the years. And we shall try to get it to you as quickly as possible and as efficiently as possible. Now, without much further ado, what better testament to history and historical time periods are there better than these items and relics from the periods that they do originate from? Now, we begin this episode on the theme of the tools of war. Now, we make a start with this World War I era German bayonet. Now, this particular bayonet was used by the German army, or the Imperial German army, and this is quite an exquisite artifact, if you will, from the First World War period. Now, if we open this, and it opens in this fashion, as you will see, it requires a bit of force, you will see that there is a title here that says Mauser Waffenfabrik, which means the Mauser Military Munitions Factory. And at the bottom is the location, which I personally can't make out because of my weak eyesight. If anyone in our audience from our dear viewers and listeners can point out what this is and where this is in Germany, I would be most grateful. And so this is an exquisite piece of World War I history. One might wonder how this ended up in the Indian subcontinent. Now, the reason is many British or British Indian soldiers decided to bring back some of this memorabilia from the trenches or their time in the trenches, most likely in France or in other European battlefields during the First World War. And so that is how this has found its way in my collection. I purchased this at a local antique shop and was quite surprised to know that this is an authentic piece of military history. Now, one thing that you might note is that the edges of the blade on both sides are not sharp, which one might think for a bayonet might be important. Yet there is this sort of, not indentation, but this sort of, this part here that affects the aerodynamics of the blade. And the tip, unlike the sides, is pointed. Now, the reason is that this particular piece of World War I militaria, as they say, was not designed for actual proper hand-to-hand combat, as one might say. Say, for example, you are caught in a sword fight, this would not be the best tool, because this was designed primarily to stab and then to obviously move to the next target. As you can see that there is a small space here to attach the rifle to the bayonet, and then to be used like so with great force. And so that brings to an end the artifacts I do have from the First World War. Now, one thing that is not exactly a weapon, but is still a pretty prominent artifact from the First World War is this interesting artifact, which is a trench whistle. Now, many of you might think, oh, a trench whistle, does it really measure at par with something as, say, large or iconic as this? But the truth is, it is in fact equally, if not more important. Imagine, dear viewers and listeners, if you will, that you are sitting waiting to lead the charge, waiting to be given the order to lead the charge or to charge at the enemy that is sitting beyond no man's land. And in the dead of silence, suddenly one hears this whistle. Now, I will spare our dear viewers and listeners from hearing this rather loud and fairly deafening whistle, but hearing this at that moment, on that gloomy day in 1916, 1918, 1917 would mean that an attack is to happen, and it would almost result, if not, well, I misspoke when I say almost, it would almost certainly result in the deaths of thousands of soldiers on both sides of the battlefield. So this trench whistle has perhaps the same amount of victims as this bayonet, if not more. And then we take a swift turn away from the First World War and we jump into our Cold War era artifacts. Now, this is my area of main interest and expertise, and like many enthusiasts, I get too excited as to where I must begin with the display. But let's stick with the World War I era theme for the moment and take a look at this interesting and exquisite gas mask. Now, one might be intrigued when one hears the thought of gas mask, and given that this is being placed in the Cold War section, that is because gas warfare or chemical warfare has its roots in World War I when the Imperial German Army developed its chemical warfare using mustard gas. However, this comes from the Cold War, and that too from the Soviet side. Now, the interesting thing is, you will note that here at the bottom, this is where one must exhale, and this pipe is where one must inhale. These are to protect the eyes from whatever substance is being sprayed at you by the enemy. But this perhaps is the most eerie item that I own in my collection, not because of its rather horrifying appearance, but because this was given to children. So imagine, if you will, that you are and since, as I said, this is from the Soviet Union, imagine yourself to be a school child in the former Soviet Union, and then to be provided this with the horrifying nightmare of nuclear proliferation and nuclear war. The thoughts that must rush in your head, the fact that what this symbolizes effectively would have been the end of the world as they knew it at that time. So this remains to be perhaps the most eerie symbol of war in this episode dedicated to the tools of war. Next, we continue with the Soviet equipment section, and I present to you this tank helmet made by the Soviet Union. Now, I will try to put this on, see if this is, as they say, a good fit, to truly demonstrate the beauty of this helmet. So you see that this helmet was designed to protect the soldiers' ears from the shell firing over, particularly when it came to the drivers and the gunners. So there is double padding over here, and there is an elaborate system to plug this into the main radio of the tank to allow the driver or the gunner or the navigator to hear the tank commander's directives and instructions. So this is an interesting piece from the Cold War period, not as eerie as the gas mask we showed earlier, but rather an interesting item. This I found at an antique shop in Vietnam, and that's what makes it more interesting, because this is not from the normal Vietnam War or the more remembered Vietnam War that many people in our audience would remember. This comes from the 1979 conflict between Vietnam and Cambodia, and you can tell that because if you look closely at this sort of production label, it says 1979. And what interesting perhaps is that had this helmet not been exported to Vietnam, it would have most certainly been exported to Afghanistan to be used in what was regarded as the Soviet-Afghan War. I apologize, this helmet is too heavy. On an interesting side note, I once took this helmet out for a cycling round, came back from half the street because of its weight. And speaking of weight and heavy items, we now focus on this bayonet, which is a Soviet Kalashnikov bayonet. Now, this is a world of different, as they would say, as compared to the German World War I bayonet that we saw earlier. Mainly because if we open this, you will see that this blade's sides and edges are also as sharp, with grooves and such, with the tip perhaps pointier and sharper than the previous one, and was indeed designed for hand-to-hand combat, unlike the previous World War I era bayonet. And otherwise, the design remains roughly the same, to attach the rifle here. And what might amuse or puzzle the viewers and listeners in our audience is this groove here. And this is used to make, if you will, a wire cutter. so that if the soldier or operative is trapped behind enemy lines, one may use this to cut through the enemy lines. And so this remains to be an interesting item from the unique Soviet arms industry. Now, what is even more interesting is that much of these were even made locally, not in Pakistan, for example, but in, say, Poland, in East Germany, in Bulgaria, each with its own design language, not regarding the blade, but the handle. So you see that this one has an all wooden handle, and that is because it's from 1954. But the 80s Soviet one featured a small black metallic grip, if you will, of sorts to hang the blade from a utility belt. This design would be continued by Poland, perhaps Czechoslovakia as well. I say perhaps because the lack of record keeping impacts this sort of information. But moving forward, this kind of design would be able to tell you, or the design of the handle would be able to tell you which country this was from. And so that is one of the more interesting sides of this particular tool of war. Next, we move to another munition, this from a more recent chapter of our Cold War. This is a 7.62 Kalashnikov bullet casing, which I found during my trip to Syria in 2018, where I visited an area that was recently liberated by what was then the Syrian Arab Army with the support from the Russian armed forces. I say liberated as because that was the government in power at the time, and it was trying to take control of the area from the HTS, etc., etc. And this remains to be an interesting item because this is a 7.62 round, which was, of course, used by the Kalashnikov rifle. And I actually slipped over this, so I decided to keep this as a keepsake for not just the Cold War, but also my clumsiness. That being said, this bullet casing, to see it in an actual battlefield that is a remnant from the old Cold War period and is a continuation, in fact, of the proxy war concept that existed back then, is an interesting item to have. And the final object that we shall show you in our collection today is this. Now, one might assume that there have been bayonets in this episode, a trench whistle, a bullet casing, a gas mask, a helmet. How might this odd-looking object pertain to history? Now, that is because this is a Minox B camera, vastly different from the camera that we are using to record this show, because this was, while initially designed for civilian use, this was a camera that was used not just by civilians. This was used by the CIA and the KGB and the Stasi and any other notable sort of who's who in the espionage world during the Cold War. And so the mechanism is fairly simple. As you saw that I pulled the camera out like so, ready to use it to photograph. Use the small viewfinder, click this button at the top, and when you hear that reel pulling sound, if you will, you close this, wind the reel or the spool, and a new piece of film comes on, ready for you to take your next picture. Now, one might be surprised to see that a camera of this size could still be easily found by the agencies that were hunting down spies. For example, the KGB could have caught this on a CIA agent and vice versa. But even if the camera was caught, there was an easy way to dispose of the film or to transfer it to the relevant agency's handler or whatnot, because the film was quite small. So as dear viewers and listeners could see probably, that this is a 15mm film. And this kind of size could be very easily concealed, say, in the lining of a trench coat, if I may be so dramatic, or the heel of a shoe, or a wine cork. And so this is an interesting testament from a battlefield not so often spoken about in the mainstream media pertaining to the history of the Cold War. And on that note, we conclude this month's episode. I hope you enjoyed watching this small insight to the collection, with obviously more to follow. And we shall see you again next month with more interesting artifacts from the history of the world. That was it for today, ladies and gentlemen. I am Muhammad Hussain Qazi, your host and curator, and this was Historian Radio's The Historian's Collection. Good night.